Thank you for inviting me to speak. I have been open about my views on Brexit. I am personally convinced that it is not the will of God that we leave the European Union, but if we do so, we should do it in as godly a way as possible. I reject the so-called prophetic words that suggest that God in some way orchestrated this. I don't believe that God did. I believe this is a human rejection of the status quo. People voted for Brexit usually on grounds of principle, but some unfortunately also voted for Brexit for xenophobic or selfish reasons. Many reportedly voted for Brexit in order to give the government a good kicking, and certainly that has happened, but it is still, in my view, wrong. Brexit is not, and was not, the will of God, and I want to argue that from a biblical, theological, rational and prophetic perspective. They together make for me a clarity of the voice of God that is, for me, overwhelming. And whilst I respect the position of Brexiteers and the debate that they have involved themselves in, I'm not convinced by the counter-arguments. God, for me, is not in the Brexit decision. The will of God is both creative and loving. In numerous places in the New Testament, God in Jesus Christ preaches that we should love one another as he loves us. His love is self-denying, it's unconditional love. His love is a love for the whole of creation, which God in Jesus Christ came to save, to recreate, to redeem, to enlighten, to welcome, to reach, to engage with and to heal. Jesus taught that this is how we should love. His mission specifically for us is to go into the world and make disciples of all the nations. And that's about, and cannot be anything other than about, loving engagement with the world. As Jesus is engaged with the world, so should we be. It is underlined by the story of the Good Samaritan, which is an overt challenge to any racist, imperialist or xenophobic culture. You'll remember that story where Jesus tells of a Jew who is set about by thieves on a lonely road, and the people with authority, including incidentally a priest, pass by on the other side. But it is the Samaritan, a different culture, a different religion, hated by many Israelites, who rescues this man, puts him on his donkey and provides an open check to the inn owner to see him well. Jesus was breaking down in that story traditional barriers, as was his encounter with a Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. Simply talking to her was countercultural. He was not prepared to let gender difference in teaching and understanding impede his engagement, nor were religious or race issues to be a barrier for him. And John puts great emphasis on this encounter in his gospel. Jesus welcomes her, of all people, into the kingdom, as she simply discovers who Jesus is. No matter what her beliefs about right places of worship, no matter what her residency or her race, no matter what her broken life has been about, she is welcomed into the kingdom. Later, you will know in the book of Acts, early in the book of Acts, Pentecost equally provides us with a scene where the disciples were with many others of different nations, but miraculously everybody understood each other. There was this working together, this understanding, and Jesus is about bringing those cultures together. At the same time, Jesus talks about relationships at length. He is saddened by divorce in Matthew 5. He avoids being elected as a king in John 6. And because if he had been, he would have been required to be a leader in war. He does not openly criticise the Roman occupation when he's given the opportunity to do so in Mark 12. He works with a centurion in Luke 7. And don't forget, the centurion was a representative of the occupying forces. He forgives the soldiers who execute him in Luke 23, and despite them not knowing what they are doing. When he hates, and he does hate from time to time, he hates hypocrisy in Matthew 23, corruption, Matthew 21, legalistic religion, Matthew 23 again, the exploitation of the poor and the abuse of women and children. And there's a lot of texts I could quote for that. In him is the fullness of God, and all nations, all people, over all time, in all places, are always welcomed. I believe Brexit to be effectively a national divorce. It is a breaking of those relationships. Divorce is justified in our society when one party is abusing the other, when there is simply no love, when there is only hurt, where one party is particularly evil. Indeed, some individuals have suggested to me that the EU itself is demonic. I find no evidence that the EU is either demonic or inherently evil. Indeed, it is a human system that has been created for the good of the people of Europe. Human systems and projects are not inherently evil. You can have good government and bad government, good hospitals, bad hospitals, good churches and bad churches. You cannot judge anything as evil simply because of its size. You judge on works, whether it is actively pursuing, ultimately, the common good, whether we are actually moving towards people loving our neighbour. Many of those who created and have sustained the European Union project have been deeply committed Christians and have done that because of their own Christianity. Our first attempt at entry to the common market in the 1960s was blocked by de Gaulle. But those signing up for inclusion then and since were people whose Christianities I have admired. In particular, Donald Soper, Reverend Lord Donald Soper, the Labour peer and former president of the Methodist Conference. In 1962, when this happened, the British Council of Churches produced a positive report on Britain in Western Europe. With joining of the common market in mind in 1962. In the 1970s, Britain in Europe group had its patrons as the archbishops of both Canterbury and Westminster, and also the moderator of the Free Church Council and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. Basically, the churches at both points, 1962 and 1970s, basically all the churches were behind the movement. At the heart of the pre-common market European movement was a determination for Europe never to go to war again. Peace would happen through trade, communication, cooperation, travel, engagement, and so on. Winston Churchill himself saw potential in a United States of Europe as a means to avoid war not long after the Second World War. He said in a speech, "It is to recreate the European family, or as much of it as we can, and provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety, and in freedom. We must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. I want to sign up to that. Jesus, of course, in the Jerusalem and the Galilee of the time, knew all about occupying powers, corrupt politicians. He knew about terrorism and war. In his teaching, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." And his brother James also talks of sowing in peace and reaping righteousness. Peacemaking and righteousness are what the common market and the European Union have striven for over the last 70 years. And that has given us a peace that is worth having. The Good Friday Agreement, which provides for an open border with Northern Ireland and Ireland, is in peril with Brexit. Unless there are no trade barriers between the UK and the EU after Brexit, which is most unlikely indeed given the red lines that have been identified by the government that they will not move from, there has to be a border somewhere. And whilst technology may be able to work some kind of border magic for some of the vehicles and people, there will still have to be searching if there are any tariffs at all on goods. And that means a border. Wherever the border is, it means a border. For me, the Good Friday Agreement is absolutely crucial to keeping a peace in Northern Ireland, which led during the 1980s particularly to so much angst and pain. It is a peace, but it is still a fragile peace, and it is easily lost. I do not believe that the EU as a development of the common market has been such an evil development of the common market that it negates the Christian views that were supported by the mainstream churches in 1975. I believe that joining the common market was the right thing to do at the time and was part of the way of the kingdom. The EU does provide many good things. It is there for the common good, including peace. Reciprocal health care is good. Reciprocal education is good. Shared research is good. The lack of trade barriers is good. The funding of projects in areas of deep poverty in our own continent is good. The visa-free travel for European holidays is good. They are self-evident, and I don't need to provide biblical references for them, but some bear biblical references. For example, the way that Ruth was treated as a refugee back in Israel, cared for and provided by others. The way that Mary and Joseph found accommodation with strangers, and presumably the help at some point of a local midwife. Paul's journeys and his support in different areas around the Mediterranean are also good examples of that welcome, that engagement with people, which is very positive. It is about loving one's neighbour. The systems for health and safety, minimum wage, workers' rights, human rights and collaboration on terrorism, security, drugs and criminality are all good. They value people as Jesus valued people. They give the frail and the weak hope as Jesus did. They provide for the common good as God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Of course, some EU systems need improvement. I'm never saying that everything is hunky-dory. There are reports of poor use and auditing of some monies, over-claiming in some countries of subsidies, Unrestricted travel is a problem, particularly when trafficking of individuals is so easy and when there is no attempt to balance refugee intake across different countries. And it does seem to me from time to time that the lack of quick European solutions to European problems is a good example of not being able to work very well together. Over-regulation is also quoted as one of the problems. But overall, the European Union and the common market before it was a good project and still is a good project. This good project is not just my view, of course, but the views of many, including most of the Christian leaders in the UK prior to the Brexit referendum. Further, most economic institutions such as the OECD, the World Bank, the Bank of England, Parliament indeed as a whole, the people paid to read and understand the political, economic and international implications, representing us, 75% of them were in favour of remaining. All of the political parties except UKIP and the Ulster Unionists, all of whom are far wiser, all of them, the politicians, far wiser world thinkers than I am, were saying that we ought to remain. The UK has its failings, but it is not inherently bad. And divorce is something to be done only when there is no other option. There is an option, and that is to stay and fight as vigorously as possible to change the bad into good. Expats are very fond of the countries that we live in and the people we live with, and there is a love that extends between our nations. However much we laugh about it, our love and care for our European neighbours is significant. Leaving the party, leaving Europe, negates the love. In fact, it does more than that. It spits in the face of those who have worked with us, who have loved us, in the face of those who negotiated with governments over the last 40 years to provide the opt-outs that we have in the UK. In the face of those who negotiated with David Cameron before the referendum to bend over backwards to accommodate UK's preferences. Our EU friends were and still are affronted by the Brexit decision. Governments, presidents and prime ministers have spoken sadly about the divorce and the breaking of relationships. Jesus was always about building relationships. That means engagement rather than walking away. And when things were going awry in the temple, he engaged with it. Engagement was the key. He does not abandon the whole institution, but instead sees the temple as being rebuilt in him. Matthew 21 or John 2. Jesus walked to Jerusalem in John 14 precisely because he wanted to engage cosmically with the world. And God is incarnate in Jesus Christ because God wants to engage with the world. And God is love because that is his nature, and love is not undertaken without engagement with people and nations and world. Where there has been 40 years of engagement, of extensive, complex and expensive negotiations, care and love with Europe through common market and European Union, it is not, in my view, a Christian act to wipe that away. The very breaking of the relationship, it seems to me, is damaging both to the UK and to the EU. Any moderating influence, any good thinking, any wise economics, any sound business practices that the UK can ever claim to bring to the table will no longer be able to influence the EU systems and government. Indeed, we will have no influence. The second issue I want to talk about is self-centeredness. When one nation removes itself from a group of nations, it believes that it is good for itself to do so and probably bad for the group that it leaves. Ultimately, that is a self-centered attitude. It believes that it will save money for itself. It will enable itself to be excluding rather than including. It believes that it will be better off not being part of the family. That is not the way of Jesus. He asks people to know that it is better to give rather than to receive, Matthew 5, Acts 20, or to consider the neighbour over and above the self, Luke 10, and back to the story of the Good Samaritan. His words are still extraordinarily radical now, and to suggest that this is the way we should act actually puts us as Christians at odds with real society that has grown up on the idea that it should live first and foremost for oneself. The UK actually has been a net contributor to the European Union, not least because it is the fifth wealthiest country in the world. The contribution, however, is not large. We pay just over 1% to be a member of the European Union from our tax revenue. That works out at less than the cost of a Costa coffee per person per week. Most of that money is used by the European Union, that net contribution, to fund projects in poorer regions in the European Union. Just as we receive money from the European Union to fund projects in the UK. 20 years ago, I worked at Sandwell College, and the European Union funded me to mount a higher national certificate in computing for people who had no jobs, but who had potential, and for their fees to be paid by the European Union. It changed 20 people's lives. A very small proportion of the money supports the structures of the European Union, but the vast majority is used for infrastructure, health and educational and research opportunities in poorer areas of the European Union particularly. That is what I call the Samaritan's purse. It is the blank cheque used by that Samaritan to help the person in need. It is a crucial and key parable which we ignore at our peril. When I was meeting and talking to groups before the referendum about Brexit, the self-centeredness of some of the comments back to me were very evident. Many were not worth repeating, and certainly not in the way of Christ. Charity begins at home was a regular phrase used. I want to tell you that that is not biblical at all. It doesn't appear in the Bible. It is the opposite to the teaching of Jesus, who puts neighbour before self. Jesus was approached at one time by a Gentile woman who wanted healing, and he asks her whether he should give help to the dogs of society in Mark 7. Dogs was a word used in the Jewish culture then to describe the Gentiles. She says yes, and he agrees to the healing. He overturns the local difference labels of his culture to be generous to all. That is what the cross indeed is about. Jesus doesn't simply stay on in Galilee to heal a few more individuals locally, but goes to Jerusalem to die to heal the world. This is absolutely crucial theology. Our obligation, like the Samaritans, like Jesus, is to the whole world, not just to ourselves. We should be celebrating the opportunity to fund projects in poorer countries in the EU as we celebrate the opportunity to fund projects via the international development money in countries outside of the EU. Now I'd like to talk about the democracy that we have and the justice that goes with it. So many calls in the Old and New Testament are about justice. Justice is a part of love. You cannot love without being just to the person you love. And I can quote Psalm 82, Isaiah 59, Jeremiah 22, lots and lots of places where justice appears. Ultimately, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Jewish Torah itself, is about justice. And of course, Jesus on the cross is about justice. Amos, one of the great prophets before Jesus, calls for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. He stands up and says it in a place where eventually they decide to throw him out. What exactly is justice? There is a crucial connection, it seems to me, between justice and democracy. Justice is about a ruling group having the best interests of the people that they rule over at all times. It is about fair laws, fair resolution of disputes. It is about truth, and truth that should be heard. It is about the right of any person who is under threat to have the opportunity to counter that threat, to speak, to be heard. The referendum was unjust democracy on 3 counts. Firstly, the lies that were peddled prior to the referendum and unbelievably repeated by people since the referendum, as if they are true, were dreadful. The classic lies, which according to the Leave campaign swung the vote, according to the Leave campaign, they thought this swung the vote, was that £350 million per week currently given to the EU could be diverted to the National Health Service. Firstly, the £350 million was the wrong figure. It was the gross figure that we pay, but we receive an enormous contribution back, and the net figure that's actually going to the EU per week, that cost a coffee per person, is of the order, at least according to the chair of the UK Statistical Authority, of the order of 136 million, less than half. There was no possibility in the foreseeable future, and there is no possibility in the foreseeable future, that we would ever be able to save 350 million per week. So that could never be given to the NHS. The lies were propagated by a bus and some unscrupulous elements of the media. There were lies, and there still are lies, about the possibility of tariff-free access to the EU in a single market while closing borders to all comers, except in Northern Ireland. That is simply not rational and not possible. It is only said in order to get the public on the side of the politicians. We don't want the hassle, so we'll tell a lie. There were warnings on the Remain campaign side. Many suggested that there could be an economic slowdown, a recession, a movement of companies from the EU to the European mainland. There were also warnings, usually not about the instant after the referendum, but 10 or so years following a referendum, following the Leave. Sadly, in my view, if Brexit does go ahead, the economy is bound to suffer. And that is actually the view of the majority of people who are asked in the polls at the moment, what do you think will happen? The economy will suffer. Lies, particularly on the Brexit side, persuaded. The margin was 3.8% or 1.4 million. It was very small. If some people believed the lies, then it was large enough to change the result. You cannot vote. You simply cannot vote justly and wisely when you don't hear the truth, or only one side. Truth is crucial to the life of Jesus Christ. In John 14, Jesus says, "I am the truth." Just as much as in the Ten Commandments and in Jesus the quoting of them when he says, "Do not bear false witness." It breaks that commandment when you tell a lie. It is a key commandment which is largely ignored when politicians want to get their own way. Lies are not acceptable, and they corrupt any democratic vote as much as they corrupt the result of a jury in the case in a court. Lies, sometimes even called alternative facts now, particularly in some newspapers, seem to have become acceptable journalism. That is inherently evil. It leads to the kind of democracy that ultimately put Hitler's Nazi party into power in Germany in the 1930s, having been voted the largest number of seats in the German parliament on a campaign of returning the country to former glory whilst using the Jews, as it happens, as scapegoats. Secondly, the referendum did not include those who were most likely to be affected by the outcome. That is grossly unjust, and it is a denial of their human rights. Listening to people was a key element of Jesus' ministry. And not only listening to people, them listening to him. 3 groups had no voice, could not say what they felt in the ballot box. Expats who have lived outside of the UK but in the EU for more than 15 years were not allowed to vote. Their long-term livelihood, health arrangements, housing, residence, children's education would inevitably be affected by the decision, but they were not allowed to vote. Provisional arrangements have been suggested, but they still have to be ratified by all of the other 27 countries. The point is, though, not that there are provisional arrangements, but that those people had no voice. They were not allowed to vote. 2 million European Union citizens resident in the UK, that's not UK citizens, but European Union citizens, except if they were from Ireland, Malta or Cyprus for historical reasons, were not allowed to vote. Australians and Canadians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis and Irish who were resident in the UK were all allowed to vote by virtue of their being Commonwealth citizens, except for Ireland. These European Union citizens in the UK were the ones who are going to be most affected, with their children in schools in the UK, working in the UK, many as hospital doctors and nurses, people who run businesses, people who employ other UK people. These did not have a vote. That is not honestly caring for the aliens in our midst, which is one of the key elements of the Judaic law that you can find in Exodus chapter 2 and many other places. There are some agreements in draft, but the point is that they did not have a voice. They did not have a vote. And the 16 to 18-year-olds, they were given a vote on the Scottish independence referendum, but not at Brexit. All of the parties in Parliament, except the Conservative Party, voted that they should be given a vote. There were 1.5 million of them. You might remember that the majority for Leave was 1.4 million. Either exit will affect young people. If they leave Scotland, if Scotland rather leaves the United Kingdom, or if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, either of those exits will affect young people who have to live with the consequences for the longest. And if they are deemed to be wise with one vote, the Scottish independence vote, why should they not have been recognised as wise for the other? I know, because it would have swung it, potentially more, towards Remain. Both of those groups have become second-class people. That is unjust, and it is not proper democracy. Thirdly, to leave the European Union is grossly unjust when the will of the UK electorate seems to be to stay in the European Union. That is demonstrated in the polls before and since the referendum. And I speak about this at the beginning of March 2018, when so far there have been around about 60 polls since the referendum. 72% of them favour Remain, with Remain being the only preferred option in all of the polls in the last 9 months. Many of those who did not vote now wish to express an opinion. After all, there are a lot more facts around to use to make a good judgment. There was and there still is an 18% majority amongst those who did not vote in favour of remaining in the European Union. The will of the people, according to the polls, is to stay in the European Union. It is even more pronounced if those unjustly denied votes were included in the electorate. Davidic government, good kingly government, a government that Israel wished to move back to, was a government that worked alongside the will of the people. It was a non-oppressing government. However, that is not what is happening here. I believe that when the deal has been struck, if there is a deal at all, there should be a free vote in Parliament. That each of the members of Parliament should be encouraged to vote according to their conscience. And there should also be a second referendum. A referendum that includes, if at all possible, the expats who have been away from the UK for 15 years, the EU residents in the UK, and the 16 to 18-year-olds. The Press Commission or some other body, and it is beyond my ability to describe, should be able to vet posters, newspapers and buses during the campaign, and if they overtly tell lies, to report that in the national media on the guilty parties. This for me is about democratic justice. the right to be heard and defend oneself in a democracy when other people want to change your life. Something like 3.8 million were denied the right to vote, and most of their votes would have gone to Remain. That would have overturned the majority, maybe as much as threefold. Lastly, I want to prophesy, or at least I want to talk about prophecy. I reject the so-called prophetic utterances which suggest that God has somehow spoken directly to the UK and the results of Brexit will be the UK coming back to God. I have seen none of that. If by coming back to God it means that the UK has to become a lot poorer first, there may be some kind of causal initiative going on there. But I don't believe that that's what is meant here. I have seen instead racism, bullying, xenophobia and name-calling rife. My own views have been vilified and basic statistics have been regarded as lies. When one individual suggested that Parliament should have a vote on Article 50, she received racist and sexist abuse and death threats. That is fundamentally evil. It is the opposite of what God is about. It is sin. When a group of politicians voted against Article 50, they appeared on the front page of newspapers as if they were not patriotic. The traditional call for unity, which Jesus calls for in John 17, is something that we all wish for somehow. Certainly we wish for it in the church, and the church doesn't perform well to that call and hasn't performed well to that over many years. Christ's call to a real oneness is about creation. And for me, it's a call to a unity in love, in politics, in home life, as well as church life. It is what Christian prophets should be preaching. We are all one humanity under God. I am no advocate for a United States of Europe, but I do support what we have now and the opt-outs that have been negotiated for each government around the 28. I believe sincerely that the UK will suffer. I believe that banks will leave London if they can find good homes elsewhere. I believe that the UK will have to receive back those who no longer can afford to live abroad. They will be the poorer pensioners and others who do not have residency rights to have healthcare in the EU. The poor are the ones always who will suffer the most. Already, because of the new weakness of sterling, the income to a pensioner on the Costa del Sol, where I live, has diminished by 15%. Where that is only the state pension for them, it means a very difficult to meet cut in income. And good people who work with us in the UK are returning to the EU. In particular, you will know that the National Health Service is finding it very tough and will continue to find it tough to recruit nurses and midwives because EU citizens are less inclined to move. As travelling becomes more difficult, we as a country will become more isolated. The more isolated you are, the more angry you become. The USA, China and Japan already have major trade deals with the European Union, but not with the UK. it will want to work, and they will want to work, with the big units. And the UK is about to become a much smaller and insignificant trading unit. Our economy will suffer because half of our exports go to the EU, and should there be any tariffs, people won't buy them as frequently as they do at the moment. The pound has dropped, and it will drop further. Our research will suffer because we do not have that automatic entry into research in other universities in the EU. Our manufacturing base and jobs, in turn, will suffer. None of this will happen overnight, but it will happen steadily over the next 10 years. We will drop in the table of wealth, education and healthcare. And that makes me sad. It will all necessarily affect the poor and the young most of all. That is how it always does work, like the recession did in the 1930s and in the 2000s. None of this is what God is about. This does not enable people to live lives that are overflowing with abundance, as in John 10. We are a wonderful nation that has been persuaded to take a dreadful route, our own isolationist way. Brexit is not the will of God. I have read lots of articles, spoken to lots of people, heard lots of speeches, but I have yet to read or hear anything that persuades me even a little that God wants this. We have 1 year left only to reconsider this decision. I hope those who hold the same views as I are able to muster the support to return to the relationship that has maintained peace in Europe, a relationship that I believe God holds very, very dear. Thank you so much for listening to me.